Have you ever felt so invisible that you were sure you could scream at the top of your lungs, and still not a single person in the world would stop to listen? For a man sitting in the dust on the outskirts of Jericho, this wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was the reality of every breath he took, of every sunrise he couldn't see, but could only feel as a weight upon his skin. His name was Bartimaeus, but his identity had been stolen by his condition. He was the blind man, a stone in the riverbed of a humanity that flowed past, around, and over him, and then forgot he was ever there. His world was a symphony of indifference, the shuffling of hurried sandals, conversations that floated just above his head, and the smell of dust and disdain that time could never wash away. His faith was a dying ember, buried under the cold ashes of years of divine silence. The promises of the prophets, of a God who opened the eyes of the blind and heard the cries of the afflicted, had turned to ash in his mouth. Prayer had become a hopeless habit, a monologue launched at a sky that seemed as empty as his eyes. But on this day, something shattered the monotony of despair. The familiar noise of the crowd changed, turning into an electric current of excitement. A name, just one, was whispered and then proclaimed, cutting through the air like a bolt of lightning. Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. For everyone else, it was a spectacle. For Bartimaeus, it was the sound of his last and only prophecy. Before we dive deep into this story, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. It's an incredible joy to know that these stories can touch hearts in so many different places. Drop your comment below and let me know. Now get ready to experience the incredible journey of someone who, with courage and vulnerability, overcame unimaginable challenges amidst pain and uncertainty. You will learn how self-compassion and recognizing your own limits can be applied to your own life to face moments of crisis and breakthrough. Let's begin. That name, Jesus, was a collection of all the stories he had gathered like a secret treasure. Stories of a teacher who didn't see the leprosy but the man, who didn't see the sin but the soul, who didn't walk away from the outcast but walked towards them. In a world that defined him by what he lacked, Jesus was known for seeing what no one else did. In that instant, a single thread of light pierced Bartimaeus' darkness. A stark choice formed in his mind, as clear as the sun he couldn't see. He could remain silent, wrapped in the familiar cloak of his resignation, and let hope walk past him forever. Or he could use the last ounce of strength he had left to do the unthinkable. To believe that his voice, the voice of a nobody, could actually be heard. The decision set his soul on fire. The fear of humiliation, the certainty of ridicule, the weight of a lifetime of being told to be quiet, all of it was consumed by a desperate urgency. He wasn't just fighting for his sight, he was fighting for his very existence, for the right to be more than the dust under the crowd's feet. He took a deep breath, and the air that filled his lungs seemed to carry the weight of all his silent years. Then, from a place deeper than his throat, a place where faith and pain become one, he cried out. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration that ripped through the sky. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The impact of his cry was met not with silence, but with a wall of hostility. Shut up, beggar, a voice near him spat. Have you no shame? Don't bother the master, another rebuked. The voices were like stones, reinforcing the message he'd heard his entire life. You are not worthy. Your suffering doesn't matter. Your place is on the ground. Those words fell on Bartimaeus like rocks, and for a moment their weight nearly crushed him. Every "be quiet" was an echo of 1,000 other slights he had suffered. His cry, born from such fragile hope, faltered in the air. His shoulders, once straight with the courage of desperation, slumped under the weight of shame. The world was right after all. He was just a nuisance. Doubt, like a snake, slithered into his heart. Who do you think you are? The voice hissed in his mind, sounding just like the crowd. Who am I to call on the Son of David? A beggar. a stain on the roadside. God doesn't listen to men like me. The familiar darkness of his resignation began to feel like a safe refuge. The silence that was once his prison now offered itself as a relief from the pain of rejection. He was haunted by ghosts. The face of his mother, aged by the sorrow of his condition. The children who once ran from him, calling him dirty blind man. The men who shoved him aside as if he were a sack of trash. The Jericho dust, which he felt on his skin and in his lungs, became the symbol of his very soul. Parched, forgotten, and trampled on by God and men. How many times has a voice of ridicule, whether from outside or from within, almost made us give up on crying out for a miracle? That moment when the whole world seems to be screaming, "Be quiet," at your faith. If you've ever felt crushed by the noise of doubt, know that your story echoes in Bartimaeus's. But then, something inside him broke. It wasn't his hope, but the dam of his resignation itself. A wave of holy fury, born from the deepest despair, rose from his gut. It wasn't anger at God, but a rage against the darkness, against the silence, against the world's verdict. He refused to let human indifference have the final say on the power of his God. He refused to die in silence. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, a strength that came directly from his soul, he screamed again. This time there was no tremor in his voice. It was no longer a plea. It was a battle cry, a guttural, primal sound that asked for no permission to exist. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The voice tore through the air, louder than the rebukes, stronger than the ridicule. It was the sound of a lifetime of pain being poured out in a single moment. The sound of chains breaking. The cry wasn't for the crowd's ears. It was aimed at heaven, but it was so potent it made the very ground tremble. The people closest to him shrank back, not in anger, but in a kind of primal awe at a faith so raw and naked. And then the impossible happened. A sudden supernatural silence fell over the road. The river of footsteps ran dry. The murmur of the crowd died. The wall of indifference didn't just fall silent. It crumbled. It wasn't Bartimaeus' scream that silenced them. It was the fact that Jesus stopped. Bartimaeus felt the shift before he understood it. The air, once thick with noise and hostility, became light and still. The absence of sound was so profound, so absolute, it felt like thunder. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, suspended between the abyss of fear and the peak of an inconceivable hope. For the first time in years, perhaps his entire life, all eyes turned to him, not with pity or contempt, but with a kind of reverent shock. The man that Jesus of Nazareth, the teacher, the prophet, had stopped everything to hear. In that moment, he ceased to be an obstacle on the side of the road. He became the center of the world, a question mark in the heart of the crowd, waiting for the word that would come next. The silence was so heavy Bartimaeus could feel it on his skin. Each second stretched into an eternity. In his chest, hope and terror waged a silent war. He couldn't see, but he felt a gaze upon him. It wasn't the cold stare of the crowd, nor the look of pity he knew so well. This was different. It was a gaze that seemed to pierce his darkness and warm his soul, like the first light of dawn. Then a voice that didn't belong to the crowd, a voice that seemed to be the source of the silence itself, spoke. It wasn't thunder, but a calm command that reordered the universe around him. Call him. Just 2 words, but they carried the authority of one who commands the tides. Instantly the world's tone changed. The same voices that had stoned him with contempt now bathed him in a gentle urgency. Someone touched his shoulder, not to push him down, but to lift him up. "Take heart," said a man. "Get on your feet. He's calling for you." A woman whispered, her once harsh voice now filled with reverent awe. "Do you see the beauty of this moment?" The same crowd that told him to shut up is now encouraging him to stand up. It's a powerful reminder that when God's voice echoes, even walls of opposition are forced to bow. Those who were once obstacles in our path can become the very voices that propel us toward our miracle. Bartimaeus didn't need to be told twice. In a single, fluid motion, he did something that shocked everyone. He threw aside his beggar's cloak. That cloak was his entire world, his bed, his shelter, the very symbol of his identity. Tossing it aside wasn't a careless gesture. It was an act of outrageous faith. It was a silent declaration that he was never going back to sitting in the dust. He got to his feet, his knees trembling but his spirit resolute, and he began to walk, not with the hesitation of a blind man, but with the certainty of a man following a light only he could feel. The crowd, once a barrier, now parted for him. The river of humanity split, and he walked on dry ground toward the sound of that voice. Finally, he stopped. He sensed a presence before him, an aura of peace, so profound it stilled the storm that had raged inside him for years. The entire world seemed to fall away. There was no more dust, no sun, no crowd. There was only him and the man who had stopped the universe to listen to him. Then the voice spoke again, this time directly to him, with a tenderness that disarmed every fiber of his being. The question wasn't, "What do you need?" or "What's wrong with you?" It was something far deeper, something that gave him back his stolen dignity. "What do you want me to do for you?" In that instant, he wasn't a charity case. He was a man with a desire, with agency, with a voice that heaven wanted to hear. The answer sprang from his soul, no longer the shriek of a desperate man, but the intimate confession of a son. His voice, now choked with emotion but clear as crystal, said only one thing, the sum of his entire life of yearning. "Rabbi, I want to see." It wasn't just about seeing the sky and the trees. It was the desire to see the face of the one who saw him. And Jesus replied, sealing the miracle before it even happened, "Go, your faith has healed you." And as the words still hung in the air, the darkness unraveled, not like a curtain being ripped, but like fog dissipating at sunrise. A warm, golden light flooded his consciousness, and the first image his newborn eyes focused on, the first sight of his entire life, was the compassionate face of the Son of David. The light was an overwhelming symphony. For the first time, the world wasn't just sound and smell, but an explosion of colors he didn't even have names for. The blue of the sky was so deep it looked like an upside-down ocean. The green of the palm fronds was more vibrant than any story could ever describe. And the faces in the crowd, each one was a universe of wonder, shock, and joy. But his gaze instinctively returned to the center of it all, to the face of Jesus. He studied it with the intensity of a man drinking water after a lifetime in the desert. He saw the compassion etched into the corners of his eyes, the serenity on his brow, the strength and kindness that radiated from him like heat from the sun. In that face, Bartimaeus didn't see a mighty king or a stern judge. He saw love in human form. The crowd's shocked silence broke, not with ridicule, but with a wave of praise that began as a murmur and swelled into a roar. "Glory to God!" an old man shouted. "A miracle! We've seen a miracle." A woman wept, her face washed in tears of joy. The people who had scorned him now pointed to him as living proof of God's power. Bartimaeus looked down and saw for the first time himself. He saw his own hands, calloused and caked with dirt, but they were the hands of a whole man. He saw his feet, planted firmly on the ground that was once just a texture beneath his body. He saw himself not as the world saw him, but as God now saw him, a man, standing tall, restored and worthy. His gaze then found the dirty cloak, discarded on the ground like an abandoned snakeskin. That piece of cloth held the sum of his old life, the loneliness, the shame, the darkness. It was the burial shroud of his beggar's identity. Without a word, he turned his back on it, the last remnant of who he used to be. He wouldn't be needing it anymore. And then, he made the first decision of his new life. He didn't run home to announce the miracle. He didn't seek out those who knew him to show off his cure. He simply turned toward Jesus, who was already beginning to walk on, and he started to follow. His healing wasn't an endpoint. It was a starting line. His steps now had a purpose. He was no longer a spectator of life, sitting on the sidelines while the world rushed by. He was a participant. He merged into the stream of followers, but he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a witness. His place was no longer on the side of the road. It was on the road itself. The world was new, reborn. The breeze that once only brought him the smell of dust now rustled the leaves of trees he could see dancing against the sky. The laughter of children, once just a sound, was now attached to little, flushed faces running down the road. Everything was connected. Everything made sense. He could still barely comprehend the vastness of what had happened. It wasn't just light that had invaded his eyes. It was the certainty that his voice, the cry of an invisible man, had the power to stop the Son of God. His faith, born of pure agony, had torn through the veil of indifference and touched the heart of heaven. He mattered. Leaving the gates of Jericho behind, the city that had been his prison of dust and darkness, he didn't look back. His old life was finished, sealed in that one cry and that one abandoned cloak. Ahead of him was the silhouette of the man who had heard him, and Bartimaeus, the former blind man, now saw more clearly than anyone in the crowd. He was following the light. Walking in the middle of the crowd was a strange and wonderful experience. For the first time he was on their level. He saw faces, not just footsteps. He saw the curiosity in the eyes of some, the devotion in others, and the infectious joy in those who had witnessed what happened. He was no longer an obstacle to be avoided, but a brother on the journey. He began to understand the true nature of his old blindness. It wasn't just the absence of light in his eyes, it had been a blindness of the soul. He had been blind to hope, deaf to the promise that his life had value. The true miracle wasn't just opening his eyes to the world, but opening his heart to the truth that he was loved by the world's creator. His gaze kept returning to Jesus, who walked a few paces ahead. He watched the way the teacher leaned in to listen to one of his disciples, the way his hand rested briefly on a tired follower's shoulder. Bartimaeus was learning in silence that the power that healed wasn't impersonal and distant, but intimate, gentle, and deeply relational. A wave of gratitude so strong hit him that he had to stop for a moment, pressing a hand to his chest as if to contain his bursting heart. Tears welled in his newly opened eyes, but they weren't the bitter tears of pain he had known. They were sweet tears, a spring of pure joy washing away the last scars of his old loneliness. He thought again of the wall of indifference that had surrounded him. He saw it clearly now. That wall wasn't made of people, it was made of fear. Fear of pain, fear of brokenness, fear that another's misery might be contagious. His desperate cry hadn't just been a plea for help, it had been an act of war against fear itself, a declaration that faith in love is stronger than the fear of pain. One of the men walking near Jesus, a broad-shouldered fisherman with an intense gaze, noticed him. The man said nothing, but his eyes met Bartimaeus's, and he gave him a short nod and a quiet smile. In that simple gesture, Bartimaeus felt a profound acceptance. It was the seal of his new identity, a silent welcome into this wandering family. The word faith echoed in his mind with a whole new meaning. Before, faith was a set of old prayers, recited in the dark. Now he understood that faith was a verb. It was the action of screaming when everything told you to be quiet. It was the motion of throwing off the cloak before you had any guarantee of a cure. Faith, he realized, was betting your entire life on the goodness of God, even when all the world's evidence screamed otherwise. He had no idea where he was going. He had no plan, no bag, not a single coin in his pocket. His only worldly possession, his cloak, was now rotting in the dust of Jericho. And yet, for the first time in his life, he felt no fear. He felt safer than he had ever been, because his security was no longer in a piece of cloth, but in the presence of the one who walked ahead. Absently, he saw a small red flower growing stubbornly between two rocks on the roadside. He crouched down, a motion once used only for begging, and touched its delicate petals. He marveled at its shape, at the perfection of such a tiny detail of the world. Appreciating that flower was, for him, an act of worship, a silent prayer of thanksgiving. The sun began to set, painting the sky with strokes of orange, pink, and violet, colors he had only ever known by name. The light, which for his entire life had been just a sensation of warmth, was now a masterpiece that left him breathless. He understood that this was not the end of a day, but the glorious beginning of his real life. Every sunrise and every sunset would forever be a memorial to the day heaven stopped to listen to a nobody's voice. As night fell, the group stopped to rest. For the first time, Bartimaeus was part of a community settling down. He watched, fascinated, as they built a fire. Moved by a new instinct, he stood up and, somewhat awkwardly, gathered a few dry branches and brought them to the flames. It was a small, almost trivial act, but to him it meant everything. He was no longer a burden to be cared for. He was one of them, contributing. He sat near the fire, his face lit by a light he could now both see and feel. The flames danced, telling silent stories in the dark. All around him, the disciples' voices were calm, discussing the Master's words, recounting the day's events. Bartimaeus just listened, soaking in the sound of fellowship, a warmth that reached deeper than the fire itself. He thought of the title he had shouted with such force, Son of David. He'd heard the Pharisees and scribes debate that term in the synagogues, grinding it into theological dust. For them, it was a concept. For him, it had been his only lifeline. He didn't need to understand all the doctrines. He just needed to know that the title meant hope, and that hope had a name: Jesus. A realization washed over him with the force of a revelation. His story was no longer just his. The blind beggar of Jericho, forgotten in the dust, would now be a story told around other campfires, in other towns. His cry would become a lighthouse for other invisible people, a testament that God hears the cries of the voiceless. The thought filled him not with pride, but with a humble, overwhelming purpose. He finally understood that God's long years of silence had not been absence, but preparation. It was the darkness that made him yearn so desperately for the light. It was the world's indifference that forged in him a faith that would not take no for an answer. The desert in his soul had made the oasis of God's love unbearably beautiful. As he was reflecting, Jesus, who was sitting on the other side of the circle, looked up. His eyes met Bartimaeus's across the dancing flames. No words were spoken. None were needed. In that gaze, Bartimaeus received all the confirmation he would ever need. It was a look that said, "I saw you, I heard you, welcome home." Bartimaeus's journey teaches us that sometimes our greatest testimony is born from our deepest pain. It is at the bottom of the well that we learn to cry out with a sincerity that heaven cannot ignore. I am so grateful to share this story with you, hoping it serves as a reminder that no voice is too small when it cries out in faith. Later he lay down to sleep, not on a filthy roadside, but on the soft earth, surrounded by the quiet breathing of his new brothers. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, the darkness that came was not a prison. It was simply an invitation to rest, with the absolute certainty that the light would be there to greet him in the morning. His last thought before drifting off to sleep wasn't about the miracle of his sight, as glorious as it was. It was about the even greater miracle of being heard. The entire world had tried to silence him, but his voice, fragile and desperate, had been powerful enough to make the King of the universe stop and ask his name. He had been seen. He had been heard. He had been known. And in the stillness of that first night, under a sky he could now call by the names of the stars, Bartimaeus, the man who was once blind, fell asleep. And for the first time in his entire life, he dreamed in color.